The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as tourists began gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Marcus Williams, a loud American businessman from Texas who had arrived in London just 2 days earlier. He wore expensive designer clothes and constantly checked his gold watch, making it clear to everyone around him that he considered himself very important. Marcus had come to London for a business deal worth millions of dollars. He owned several oil companies back home and was used to getting his way in every situation. People usually listened when he spoke, and doors opened quickly when he flashed his wealth. But London was different, and he was about to learn that some things couldn't be bought with money. The Royal Guards stood perfectly still in their bright red uniforms and tall black hats. Their faces showed no emotion as hundreds of tourists took photos and videos. These guards were highly trained soldiers who had served their country with honor. Each one had gone through months of difficult training to earn the right to protect the royal family. Standing among the guards was Sergeant James Mitchell, a 28-year-old soldier who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before being selected for this prestigious position. He came from a working-class family in Manchester and had worked hard his entire life to reach this point. His father had been a factory worker, and his mother cleaned offices at night to help pay the bills. James knew the value of respect and dignity. Marcus pushed through the crowd, elbowing past families with children and elderly tourists who had been waiting patiently. He wanted the perfect photo for his social media accounts back home. His followers needed to see that he could go anywhere and do anything he pleased. Money had always solved his problems before, and he expected the same treatment here. The crowd grew larger as more tourists arrived. People spoke in different languages, all excited to witness this famous British tradition. Children sat on their parents' shoulders to get a better view, while teenagers took selfies with the palace in the background. Everyone seemed to understand that this was a special moment that required respect and quiet behavior. But Marcus had different ideas. He pulled out his expensive phone and started recording a video for his business partners back in Texas. Speaking loudly into the camera, he began making jokes about the guards and their uniforms. His voice carried across the quiet courtyard, causing other tourists to turn and stare at him with disapproval. James heard every word but remained perfectly still, as his training required. His job was to stand guard regardless of what happened around him. He had dealt with difficult tourists before, but something about this man's attitude bothered him more than usual. The disrespect in Marcus's voice was clear, and other tourists were beginning to look uncomfortable. The ceremony was about to begin, and the atmosphere should have been one of anticipation and respect. Instead, Marcus's loud behavior was creating tension among the crowd. Parents pulled their children closer, and several elderly visitors shook their heads in disappointment. The beautiful tradition was being disrupted by one man's need for attention. Marcus noticed that people were watching him, which only encouraged him to be louder and more obnoxious. He thought their stares meant they were impressed by his confidence and wealth. In his mind, he was the most interesting person in the courtyard, and everyone should be grateful for the entertainment he was providing. Little did Marcus know that his behavior was being noticed by more than just tourists. Palace security officers watched from their positions, and several guards had already taken note of the disruptive American. The situation was developing in a way that would soon teach Marcus a lesson he would never forget. As the ceremony preparations continued, Marcus became bolder with his comments. He stepped closer to Sergeant Mitchell, pointing his phone directly at the guard's face while making loud observations about British culture. His voice echoed off the palace walls as he complained about everything from the weather to the food he had eaten since arriving in London. "Look at this guy," Marcus said into his phone camera, gesturing toward James, standing there like a statue in that ridiculous outfit. "I bet he makes less in a year than I spend on my car payments." Several tourists gasped at his rudeness, but Marcus seemed to enjoy the reaction he was getting from the crowd. James remained motionless, but inside he felt a burning anger. This wasn't just about personal insults anymore. Marcus was showing disrespect to the uniform, the monarchy, and everything James had sworn to protect. The guard's military training had taught him to control his emotions, but this man was testing limits that few people had ever approached. A British family standing nearby tried to quietly explain to Marcus that his behavior was inappropriate, but he waved them away dismissively. "Mind your own business," he snapped. "This is a free country, isn't it? I can say whatever I want." The father of the family looked embarrassed and moved his wife and children to a different spot in the crowd. Marcus then made the mistake that would change everything. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick roll of cash, waving it in front of James's face. "Hey, soldier boy," he said with a cruel smile. "I bet you've never seen this much money in your life. Why don't you break that silly pose and take a real photo with me? I'll give you £100. The insult cut deep because Marcus had no idea about James's background or why he had chosen to serve his country. James came from a family that had always valued honor over money. His grandfather had fought in World War II, and his father had taught him that some things were more important than wealth. The offer wasn't just rude, it was an attack on everything James believed in. Other tourists began to murmur among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. An elderly British gentleman stepped forward and politely asked Marcus to stop, explaining that the guards were performing an important duty. But Marcus turned on him too, making loud comments about British teeth and accents that caused several people to gasp in shock. The situation was escalating quickly, and palace security officers began moving closer to the scene. They had protocols for dealing with disruptive visitors, but they wanted to see how far Marcus would push before taking action. The guards themselves were not allowed to respond to insults, but there were other people watching who didn't have the same restrictions. Marcus's business partner back in Texas would later say that power and money had gone to Marcus's head over the years. He had become used to treating people badly without facing any consequences. Employees at his companies were afraid to stand up to him because they needed their jobs. Restaurant servers and hotel staff smiled politely, while he acted rudely because they wanted good tips. But Buckingham Palace was different. Here Marcus was just another tourist, and his money meant nothing to people who had dedicated their lives to serving something greater than themselves. The guards around James had all earned their positions through sacrifice and hard work. They had left comfortable civilian lives to serve their country, and they weren't impressed by flashy displays of wealth. As Marcus continued his performance for his phone camera, he failed to notice that the crowd around him was changing. The respectful tourists were moving away, but they were being replaced by people who looked less patient and more serious. Some were off-duty soldiers who happened to be visiting the palace. Others were London locals who had come to see the ceremony, and were growing angry at this disruption of their beloved tradition. James felt the weight of his rifle on his shoulder and remembered his oath to protect and serve. He thought about his fellow soldiers who had died in Afghanistan defending the values that Marcus was now mocking. The guard's jaw tightened slightly, the only sign that the insults were having any effect on him at all. The tension in the courtyard reached a breaking point when Marcus decided to physically touch Sergeant Mitchell. Ignoring all the warning signs from the crowd around him, Marcus reached out and poked James in the chest while continuing to record with his phone. "Come on, tin soldier," he laughed. "I know you can hear me. Don't you want to earn some easy money?" This physical contact crossed a line that even the most patient person couldn't ignore. James was trained to remain still during the ceremony, but he was also trained to protect himself and the palace from potential threats. Marcus's behavior had moved beyond simple rudeness into something that could be seen as aggressive and potentially dangerous. The crowd held its breath as they waited to see what would happen next. Many tourists had their own phones out now, recording what they sensed was about to become a memorable moment. Children asked their parents what was happening, while adults tried to explain that the American man was being very rude to someone who deserved respect. What Marcus didn't know was that each royal guard had backup nearby. Other soldiers were positioned around the courtyard, ready to respond if any guard needed assistance. These men had been watching the situation develop and were already moving into position. They communicated through subtle hand signals that tourists wouldn't notice, but that other soldiers understood perfectly. Sergeant Mitchell made a decision that would later be praised by his commanding officers. Instead of breaking his pose or responding with anger, he demonstrated the kind of self-control that made him worthy of his position. He remained perfectly still, but his eyes shifted slightly to make eye contact with Marcus for the first time since the harassment began. That look said everything that James couldn't speak aloud. It was the look of a professional soldier who had seen real combat, and wasn't intimidated by a loud businessman with too much money and too little sense. Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine intimidation from someone he couldn't buy or bully. But Marcus was too proud and too foolish to recognize the warning. Instead of backing down, he pushed harder. "What are you going to do about it?" he asked, moving even closer to James. "You can't touch me. I'm an American citizen and I have rights. Your job is to stand there and look pretty for the tourists." The crowd around them began to change noticeably. British tourists who had been trying to be polite were now openly expressing their anger at Marcus's behavior. An elderly woman who had lived through World War II stepped forward and told Marcus exactly what she thought of his disrespect for the soldiers who protected their country. "These young men risked their lives for us," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through real hardship. "You should be ashamed of yourself treating them like entertainment. They're not here for your amusement. They're here because they chose to serve something bigger than themselves." Marcus turned his rudeness on the elderly woman, making comments about her age and appearance that shocked even the tourists who didn't speak English well. His behavior was so obviously wrong that language barriers didn't matter. People from different countries began shaking their heads and expressing their disapproval in their own languages. A group of British teenagers who had been taking photos nearby decided they had seen enough. One of them, whose older brother was serving in the military overseas, stepped up to Marcus and asked him to stop being disrespectful. When Marcus responded with more insults, the teenagers began filming him with their phones, planning to share his behavior on social media. The situation was spiraling out of control, but Marcus seemed to think he was winning some kind of contest. His ego wouldn't let him see that he was surrounded by people who thought his behavior was disgusting. He had spent so many years being the biggest person in every room that he couldn't recognize when he was completely outnumbered. Palace security officers were now positioned around the courtyard, ready to remove Marcus if necessary, but they wanted to give him one more chance to recognize his mistake and leave voluntarily. They had dealt with difficult tourists before, but Marcus's combination of wealth, arrogance, and complete lack of self-awareness made him particularly challenging. James continued to stand perfectly still, but other guards around the courtyard were beginning to notice the disturbance. The ceremony was supposed to start soon, and this disruption needed to be resolved quickly. The royal family's schedule couldn't be delayed because one tourist didn't understand how to behave properly in public. Marcus's next move sealed his fate in a way he never could have imagined. Frustrated that his money and insults weren't getting the reaction he wanted, he decided to escalate the situation even further. He grabbed James's rifle and tried to pose for a selfie, while making jokes about British military equipment being outdated compared to American weapons. The moment Marcus touched the rifle, everything changed. Touching a guard's weapon was not just disrespectful, it was a serious security breach that triggered immediate responses from multiple directions. James, still maintaining his composure, used a quick movement to secure his weapon, while palace security officers rushed toward the scene from their positions around the courtyard. The crowd gasped as they realized they were witnessing something far more serious than a rude tourist making inappropriate comments. Parents pulled their children back as several large security officers surrounded Marcus, who suddenly found himself in the center of a situation he couldn't control with money or loud talking. "Sir, you need to come with us immediately," said the lead security officer, a former military man whose calm voice carried unmistakable authority. Marcus looked around and suddenly realized that his phone was no longer recording, and the crowd was no longer watching him with curiosity. They were watching with a mixture of shock and satisfaction that justice was finally being served. For the first time since arriving in London, Marcus felt genuinely afraid. These weren't employees he could fire or service workers he could intimidate with bad reviews. These were professional security officers who had dealt with much more dangerous people than a loud American businessman. His usual tactics of demanding to speak to managers or threatening lawsuits seemed suddenly childish and useless. "Do you know who I am?" Marcus sputtered, falling back on the phrase that had opened doors for him throughout his adult life. "I'm a successful businessman with connections in the American government. You can't treat me like this." But his words fell flat in the courtyard where real power meant something very different than money in a bank account. The security officers weren't impressed by his claims or his expensive clothes. They had protected actual government officials, celebrities, and members of the royal family. A wealthy tourist having a public tantrum was barely worth their attention except for the disruption he was causing to the ceremony and the disrespect he had shown to the guards. As Marcus was led away from the ceremonial area, the crowd began to applaud. The applause started with the elderly British woman who had confronted him earlier, but it quickly spread throughout the courtyard. Tourists from different countries joined in, showing their appreciation that someone had finally stopped the disruption and restored dignity to the ceremony. James remained at his post, but those who looked carefully could see the smallest hint of satisfaction in his eyes. He had maintained his professionalism throughout the entire ordeal, proving that his training and character were stronger than any insult or provocation. The other guards around the courtyard stood a little straighter, proud of their colleagues' performance under pressure. The teenagers who had been filming Marcus's behavior were already uploading videos to social media platforms. Within hours, clips of the rude American tourist would be viewed by millions of people around the world. But unlike the positive attention Marcus had expected to receive, the videos showed him as an example of everything wrong with entitled tourist behavior. Marcus was taken to a security office inside the palace complex, where he was questioned about his intentions and background. His claims about being an important businessman were checked and verified, but his wealth and status actually worked against him. The security officers reasoned that someone with his resources should have known better than to behave so inappropriately in such a significant location. The business deal that had brought Marcus to London began to fall apart as news of his arrest spread through social media and news outlets. His British partners saw the videos of his behavior and decided they didn't want to be associated with someone who showed such poor judgment and lack of respect for local customs and traditions. Back in the courtyard, the changing of the guard ceremony proceeded as scheduled. The disruption was quickly forgotten as tourists focused on the beautiful tradition they had come to witness. James and his fellow guards performed their duties with the same precision and dignity they showed every day, proving that their commitment to service was stronger than any temporary obstacle. The crowd watched with renewed appreciation for the guards, understanding better now what kind of character and training was required to maintain such composure under difficult circumstances. Children who had witnessed Marcus's behavior asked their parents about the importance of treating others with respect, especially those who serve their country. Inside the palace security office, Marcus discovered that his problems were just beginning. The officers explained that touching a guard's weapon was considered a potential terrorist threat under British law, especially at such a high-profile location. His American passport and business credentials meant nothing when it came to national security protocols that had been developed after years of real threats and attacks. The questioning revealed more about Marcus's character than he probably intended to share. When asked why he had behaved so disrespectfully, he couldn't give any reasonable explanation. His answers showed that he genuinely believed his wealth gave him the right to treat other people however he wanted, regardless of their position or the setting. "I was just having some fun," Marcus insisted, still not understanding the seriousness of his situation. "Those guards are paid to stand there and be looked at. I don't see what the big deal is." His complete lack of awareness about military service, national traditions, and basic human respect shocked even the experienced security officers. The lead investigator, a woman who had served in military intelligence before joining palace security, explained to Marcus that the guards were highly trained soldiers who had chosen to serve their country in one of the most prestigious positions available. She told him about James's background in military service, hoping to help Marcus understand the magnitude of his disrespect. But Marcus seemed incapable of grasping concepts like honor, duty, and service to something greater than oneself. His worldview was built entirely around personal profit and individual achievement. The idea that someone would dedicate their life to protecting others without expecting immediate financial reward was completely foreign to him. Meanwhile, news of the incident was spreading far beyond London. American news outlets picked up the story, and Marcus's business associates back in Texas began receiving calls from reporters asking for comments about their partner's behavior. The videos of Marcus harassing the guard were being shared millions of times, making him famous in exactly the way he had never wanted. His oil company's stock prices began to drop as investors worried about the negative publicity. Business partners started canceling meetings and reconsidering their relationships with Marcus's firms. The incident was becoming a public relations disaster that would cost him far more than the money he had waved around trying to bribe James. Back at the palace, the ceremony had concluded successfully, and James was finally able to relax his position. His commanding officer praised him for maintaining his composure under extremely difficult circumstances. The other guards gathered around to congratulate him on his professionalism and self-control. "You represented everything good about our service today," his sergeant told him. "That man tried to break you down, but you showed him what real strength looks like. Every guard in the regiment should be proud to serve alongside you." James felt satisfied that he had honored his uniform and his country, even when faced with such blatant disrespect. The tourists who had witnessed the incident were sharing their own stories on social media, praising the guards' restraint and professionalism, while criticizing Marcus's behavior. Many mentioned how the experience had given them greater appreciation for the dedication required to serve in such a position. Family from Germany wrote online about how their children had learned an important lesson about respect and dignity by watching how James handled the situation. A retired American veteran who had been visiting London with his wife wrote a long post defending the British Guard and apologizing for his fellow Americans' embarrassing behavior. The elderly British woman who had confronted Marcus was interviewed by a local news station and became something of a celebrity herself. Her defense of the guards resonated with people around the world who were tired of seeing disrespectful behavior go unchallenged. She received hundreds of messages thanking her for speaking up. As the day progressed, Marcus remained in custody, while authorities decided what charges to file against him. His expensive lawyers were flying in from America, but British law was clear about threats to national security. His wealth and connections couldn't undo the fact that he had physically interfered with an armed guard at one of the country's most important buildings. The incident was being discussed in Parliament, where members praised the guard's professionalism and called for stronger penalties for tourists who showed disrespect to military personnel. The story had touched a nerve with people who believed that service members deserved better treatment from the public they protected. James went home that evening to his small apartment in London, where he called his parents in Manchester to tell them about his day. His mother cried when she heard how proudly he had represented their family values under such difficult circumstances. His father, a man of few words, simply said he was proud to call James his son. 3 days after the incident, Marcus found himself facing consequences he had never imagined possible. The British court system moved quickly in cases involving national security, and his expensive legal team discovered that money couldn't buy their way out of every situation. The judge who reviewed his case was a former military officer who had little patience for wealthy tourists who showed disrespect to serving soldiers. The charges against Marcus included disturbing the peace, interfering with military personnel in the execution of their duties, and creating a public nuisance at a protected government facility. Each charge carried potential jail time and substantial fines, but the real punishment was happening outside the courtroom as his reputation crumbled around the world. Social media had turned Marcus into an international symbol of entitled American tourist behavior. The hashtag #The Royal Guard Respect was trending globally, with millions of people sharing stories about the importance of honoring military service members. His face appeared on news programs across multiple continents, always accompanied by unflattering descriptions of his behavior. The business consequences were devastating. His major oil contracts in Texas were being reviewed by partners who didn't want to be associated with someone who had become a global laughingstock. Environmental groups that had been protesting his companies for years suddenly had a new weapon. They could point to his behavior as evidence of his poor character and judgment. His own employees were embarrassed to work for him. Several key executives resigned rather than face questions about their boss's actions. The company's public relations team was working overtime trying to distance the business from Marcus's personal behavior, but the damage was already done. Meanwhile, James had become an unexpected hero. Videos of his restraint and professionalism were being used in military training programs as examples of how to handle difficult situations with dignity. He received letters from soldiers around the world who thanked him for representing their profession so well under pressure. The British Army used the incident as a teaching moment. inviting James to speak to new recruits about the importance of maintaining composure and professionalism even when faced with extreme provocation. His story became part of the training curriculum for guards at all major government buildings. Queen Elizabeth herself was briefed on the incident and reportedly expressed her appreciation for James's conduct. While she couldn't make public comments about specific security matters, palace sources indicated that she was pleased with how her guards had handled such a challenging situation. The tourism industry in London actually benefited from the incident, as more people wanted to visit and show proper respect to the royal guards. Tour guides began including stories about appropriate behavior in their presentations, using Marcus as an example of what not to do when visiting historical sites. James's commanding officers recommended him for commendation, recognizing that his actions had brought positive attention to the British military at a time when recruitment was challenging. His example showed young people that military service could be both honorable and personally rewarding. The international media coverage also sparked discussions about cultural differences and the importance of researching local customs before traveling. Travel blogs and guidebooks began including more detailed information about appropriate behavior at ceremonial sites, using the Buckingham Palace incident as a case study. Marcus's legal team eventually negotiated a plea deal that allowed him to avoid jail time in exchange for a substantial fine, community service, and a formal public apology. The fine alone was larger than most people's annual salaries, but for Marcus it represented something more painful than money: public humiliation and the loss of his carefully constructed image as a successful businessman who could handle any situation. The required public apology was broadcast internationally, showing a very different Marcus than the one who had harassed James. Standing before cameras with his lawyers beside him, he looked tired and defeated as he read a statement acknowledging his inappropriate behavior and expressing regret for disrespecting the guard and the institution he represented. But even this apology seemed forced and insincere to many viewers. Marcus struggled with the words, clearly uncomfortable admitting he had been wrong. His body language suggested he still didn't fully understand why his behavior had been so offensive to so many people around the world. The community service portion of his sentence required him to work with veterans organizations in London, helping with programs that supported former soldiers transitioning to civilian life. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the man who had mocked a serving soldier was now required to help others who had dedicated their lives to military service. 6 months after the incident, the consequences for both men had become clear. Marcus returned to Texas to find that his business empire had suffered permanent damage. Several major contracts had been canceled, and his reputation in the oil industry was severely tarnished. The man who had once commanded respect through wealth and intimidation now found doors closing wherever he went. His former business partners spoke quietly among themselves about Marcus's judgment and character. If he could behave so poorly in public, they wondered, what other decisions might he make that could damage their investments? Trust, once lost in the business world, was nearly impossible to rebuild. The incident had cost Marcus more than money. It had cost him his identity. For years he had defined himself by his ability to get what he wanted through force of personality and financial power. Now he was forced to confront the reality that his behavior had been wrong, and that his wealth couldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions. His family relationships also suffered. His adult children were embarrassed by the international attention their father's behavior had attracted. Business associates who had once invited him to social events found reasons to exclude him from their gatherings. The social circles he had worked years to join suddenly became closed to him. James, meanwhile, had been promoted and was now training new guards in the techniques that had served him so well during the confrontation. His story was told to every new recruit as an example of how to maintain dignity and professionalism under extreme pressure. The incident that could have been a negative experience had become a defining moment that enhanced his career. The British military used James's example in recruitment materials, showing potential soldiers that their service would be respected and valued. His calm response to Marcus's provocations demonstrated that modern soldiers needed both physical courage and emotional intelligence to succeed in their roles. James received invitations to speak at military academies and leadership conferences around the world. His message was simple but powerful. True strength came from self-control and commitment to something greater than personal interests. Young soldiers looked up to him as an example of what they could achieve through dedication and proper values. The Guards' personal life also improved. The positive attention he received led to opportunities he never could have imagined. Publishers approached him about writing a book about military service and personal values. Television producers wanted to feature his story in documentaries about honor and duty, but James remained humble about his newfound fame. He continued to live in the same modest apartment and maintained the same relationships with his family and friends from Manchester. The incident had shown him that doing the right thing, even when it was difficult, could have positive consequences that lasted far longer than any temporary discomfort. The broader impact of the incident continued to ripple outward. Tourism officials in London reported that visitors were more respectful and better behaved at ceremonial sites. Tour guides noted that people seemed more interested in learning about the history and significance of the places they visited rather than just taking photos for social media. Marcus's story became a cautionary tale told in business schools about the importance of character and cultural sensitivity. His downfall showed students that success built on arrogance and disrespect for others was ultimately unsustainable. Even in a globalized economy, local customs and basic human decency still mattered. The incident also sparked conversations about the treatment of service members in many countries. Veterans organizations reported increased support and donations from people who had been moved by James's story. The respect shown for one British Guard had somehow translated into greater appreciation for military service everywhere. Years later, Marcus would occasionally be recognized on the street or in business meetings as that American who insulted the Royal Guard. The incident had become permanently attached to his identity, a reminder that moments of poor judgment could have lasting consequences. He learned too late that respect couldn't be bought and that dignity was earned through character, not wealth. James continued his military career with distinction, eventually rising to senior leadership positions where he could influence military culture and training. He never forgot the lesson that doing the right thing, even when facing provocation and disrespect, was always worth the effort. His response to one rude tourist had become a legacy that would inspire soldiers for generations to come. The story became a perfect example of how individual actions, both good and bad, could have consequences far beyond what anyone might expect. Marcus's few minutes of poor behavior had destroyed years of business success, while James's quiet professionalism had built a reputation that would last his entire lifetime.